So hi, everybody. I'm Sally Quinn. I'm the founding editor of On Faith, a blog here at the Washington Post, and also the author of Finding Magic, which was just released last week. And my publicist insisted on bringing my book out. Of course, I think it's shameless, but what could I do? Anyway, I know that you all know who Deepak Chopra is. I've known him for 10 years, and he was one of the first people I interviewed with On Faith, and I have revered him ever since. He's the founder of the Chopra Foundation and co-founder of the renowned Chopra Center for Wellness in Carlsbad, California. He's also a best-selling author and a pioneer in the areas of integrative medicine and personal transformation. I'm thrilled to welcome him to the Washington Post today as our keynote speaker to talk about his remarkable career as a health and medical transformer. So Deepak, why don't you, just let me say this. When I first interviewed Deepak 10 years ago, he was not exactly mainstream. And he came into the studio and he had, you don't have your flashy shoes on, but he had on these incredible sneakers that were, I think they lit up in the dark, and he had these fabulous glasses with rhinestones, and he had this incredible Indian thing on. And I just thought, what is this? You know, I had no idea what to expect. And I sat down and I was riveted. I mean, we were supposed to have an hour interview and it went on for at least 2 hours. We had to cut it way back. And then he came to Washington about 6 months later, and I had him for dinner. And my husband, Ben Bradley, was there, and Bob Woodward was there, and they all kind of said, oh, really, Deepak Chopra? And they didn't leave the table until 1 o'clock in the morning. They were completely blown away by Deepak and everything he had to say, which was really, we talk about transformative. It was incredible. Now, Deepak, I don't know whether.
By the way, I'm about to go off mainstream again.
Well, I was just about to say, I am so sorry to tell you that you are now mainstream, and I don't know whether that's good or bad.
I usually hang out with sages, psychotics, and geniuses. It's a motley group of strange people.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into the wellness biz, and then I have some questions to ask you.
I'm an internist, endocrinologist by training, and I trained in the 1970s and got especially interested in neuroendocrinology. And when we were residents and fellows, there was a revolution going on because of a new technique called radioimmunoassay. So you could look at peptides in a way that you couldn't before that. And there was a lot of talk about neurotransmitters, neuropeptides, and very early on, I had the intuition that emotions correspond to biological states. That, of course, we know if you have stress, you have a certain kind of biology, and if you have joy or you fall in love, the biology is quite different. And of course, today we can identify a lot of these neuropeptides, as you call them. I call them molecules of emotion: serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, opiates, and a new one called anandamide, which is the peptide for bliss or happiness. Happens to be an immunomodulator. So it's been a long journey.
Can you buy that?
No, but you can generate it if you fall in love.
Just like that, huh?
Just like that.
So anyway, you write about, you've done this book, You Are the Universe, and he's got a book coming out, which nobody has even seen, but I've seen a lot of it, called The Healing Self, which is riveting. And it just touches on everything about your well-being. But you have 6 pillars of well-being. And why don't you tell us what they are? Because I think everybody needs to know exactly.
So I should preface that, I'll answer your question, by saying that only 5%, and unless you're really in the know right now. You may or may not know this fact. Only 5% of disease-related gene mutations are fully penetrant. So if you have a gene mutation for a disease, a chronic illness, heart disease, cancer, autoimmune illness, whatever, only 5% of those mutations are fully penetrant, which means they predict the disease. If somebody has a gene like the BRCA gene, for example, or certain types of Alzheimer's
That's
genes.
the one that Angelina Jolie had.
That's the one she had. Then that's fully penetrant. It predicts the disease. 95% of disease-related gene mutations are related to lifestyle. They don't predict the disease. They make it more likely that you will have the disease, but it doesn't mean that you will have it. So this is a new era with epigenetics, with neuroplasticity, with what we know about the microbiome, the fact that your body is in activity that is constantly being influenced by what's happening in your life, that which we call experience. So 6 pillars. Sleep. Actually, one of the biggest predictors of Alzheimer's is lack of sleep. Lack of sleep causes inflammation in the body. It also causes disruption in the microbiome. It causes amyloid accumulation in the brain, and it is a predictor of premature death.
Well, like how much sleep do we need, really?
Well, ideally speaking, 7 to 8 hours of restful sleep, not induced by a tranquilizer or a sleeping pill.
But you see all these really powerful, successful men and people like Bill Clinton who
we have a
claim
president right now who doesn't
or the president now who says he only needs 3 or 4 hours of sleep. He's tweeting at 5 o'clock in the morning.
It's not true. If you are lacking sleep, your body is going to have inflammatory markers that are way up, and it's a predictor of many chronic illnesses. So anybody can check out the evidence. Number 2 pillar, so that's number 1. Number 2 is stress management in any way or form. Of course, reflective self-inquiry, contemplative practices, meditation, etc. Very useful in decreasing the biological consequences of stress.
Let me just ask you about stress, because there's stress and there's stress. I mean, you know, a lot of us are busy and we're running around and we've got all these things to do, and you know, there's stress in the lives and the kids and the dogs and your college and salaries and, you know, maybe fight with your boss. And then there's stress like you're in the middle of a war, or you're in the middle of a hurricane, or you're in the middle of an earthquake, and everybody around you is dying and your life is falling apart, and that's a different kind of stress. So how do you manage stress when you're in a really, or that, you know, one of your loved ones is dying? How do you
the stress is a response to threat. So it's a biological response to physical threat or psychological threat. And it's a protective response because your cortisol goes up, your adrenaline goes up, you prepare for what is called the fight-flight response. And if your house is burning, you need to run out. If somebody mugs you, you need to protect yourself. In a war, stress actually helps people in combat. But if it's a long-standing, chronic, inappropriate stress, which is an exaggerated response, a flight-fight response to maybe a tweet, then that kind of low-grade chronic stress will wreak havoc in your body.
Okay, next one.
Number 3 is movement and exercise, but for me, particularly now, with all the research that we are doing on yoga, mind-body coordination, and breathing techniques, you can actually show that our entire civilized world is on what is called sympathetic overdrive. And they're always in that response, ready to go to war. And mind-body techniques like yoga, breathing, tai chi, qigong, all the Eastern martial arts are extremely useful in restoring homeostasis in your body. or what we call self-regulation. So that's number 3.
So when you say movement, how much movement do you need?
10,000 steps a day at least.
Which is, well, how many hours would that be a day? I mean, I know
It
I know
depends,
you wear these little things.
I spend a lot of time in New York. I don't have to do anything other than walk
Yeah.
to wherever I'm going.
Yeah.
And 10,000 steps is not a big deal
What
at
is
all.
it, half an hour, something like that?
It's approximately 5 miles a day.
And you talk about yoga a lot, but you don't mention other, like running, or playing basketball or
They're
football or others.
all extremely useful, but yoga is very specific in that it stimulates what we call the vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve. It goes from your midbrain. It influences your facial expressions, so you can tell your mood. It influences the tone of your voice, if it's friendly or stressed. It influences something called heart rate variability. It influences the bioregulation of organs in the body, and it also influences the microbiome, which is 2 million genes in your body, which are not human but bacterial. So yoga is very targeted to self-regulation because of the way it influences what we call visceral nerves, not the nerves that go to your muscles. So most exercises are about muscular activity. Yoga is about muscular activity as well as self-regulation in the viscera. And now there's a lot of interest in the pharmaceutical industry in what they call bioelectric medicine. And people have found that even if you stimulate the vagus nerve with a device, electromagnetic device, it helps in intractable epilepsy, it decreases inflammation, may improve your asthma, reverse things like rheumatoid arthritis. This is a very cutting-edge area that needs to be explored a lot, but there's enough literature to say that yoga is not the same thing as exercise.
So what about number 4?
Number 4 is emotions. This is very interesting because all these years we've studied the emotions of anger, hostility, stress, running out of time, all the things that, major epidemic of modern civilization. But very few people have studied the role of emotions like gratitude, for example. We did a recent study which was published in a peer-reviewed journal where people kept a gratitude journal at night and their inflammatory markers go down. And all their symptoms, this was a study we did with chronic heart failure patients, and they had remarkable responses just by experiencing gratitude in a journal, writing down all the things they could be grateful for. But we also know that love, compassion, empathy, joy, equanimity, or peace have their own biology. And this was not known 30 years ago.
But again, they're emotions that are legitimate emotions about, your husband is abusive, or he's having an affair and walks out, or your wife, or your child is being bullied at school, or you're sad because somebody dies. Those emotions are things that are thrust upon you.
As long as you're not a bundle of conditioned reflexes and nerves that's constantly being triggered by people, circumstances, and events into predictable outcomes, as long as you're aware of your reaction to react, and as long as you consciously react, then even those emotions can be useful. After all, emotions have biological functions. So anger readies, in evolutionary theory, anger readies an animal for combat. Fear readies an animal for flight. Disgust warns mammals of the likelihood of contamination of nauseous foods. So all emotions, whether even guilt, depression, humiliation, shame, they're not found in all mammals. They're only found in primates and humans, where there's a social hierarchy. They inform mammals of their status in the pecking order. So, when you look at emotions, they have biological reasons, and they're meant for survival, even the negative emotions you're talking about. But when they're inappropriate, that's when you get chronic illness.
Okay, where are we now? Number 5?
5 is nutrition. So today, our food, mostly industrial food production, is contaminated mostly with petroleum products, Agent Orange, in the food. So anything that is manufactured, refined, processed, has antibiotics, has hormones. I'm going to stay away from GMOs because that's very controversial at the moment. But if your food is contaminated and has poison, hormones, antibiotics, petroleum products, it inflames the microbiome, and it does so as soon as you've eaten the food. And these are 2 million genes that speak to the 23,000 human genes. And so the connection between the epigenome, the genome, and the microbiome is very important, and it's influenced by food. Now, when I was in training, or even in practice, when patients came to me and said, I changed my diet and I had a remission, I would say, no, diet has nothing to do with it. We can't say that anymore. Diet influences your gene activity from meal to meal, okay?
Well, I just finished, when I saw you, I hadn't seen you for a while, and I said, you look great because you'd lost weight. Was that something that you did consciously?
I'm very involved with the research on epigenetics and microbiome, and we are looking now at the effect of plant-based diets. And even
Are you a vegetarian?
I am a vegetarian, yes. And plant-based diets are much more healthy for the microbiome. Even meat-based diets in a Mediterranean diet aren't bad, except for the fact that meat, as we normally get it in the US and in most of the Western world, is animals that come from factories that have been given growth hormone, sometimes estrogen, other hormones, antibiotics, and that's the problem with industrial food production.
And what's number 6?
Number 6, I think most people may not be familiar with it, but we are very interested in doing a lot of research on it. How many people have occasionally walked barefoot on the beach, on the earth, grass? Okay, so when you walk barefoot on the beach, you feel better, I'm sure. And the reason is that when you ground yourself to the earth, negative ions come from the earth into your body, and they neutralize the excess free radicals that have built up and that cause inflammation. So we are looking at grounding, as we now call it, and the effects on inflammation in the body, on sleep, on chronic disease, on stress management, and very importantly, on restoring circadian rhythms when you have jet lag. So, you know, when you have jet lag, it's because your biological rhythms are out of sync with the circadian rhythms, which is as a consequence of the Earth spinning on its axis. But circadian rhythms are tied to seasonal rhythms, lunar rhythms, gravitational rhythms. We are part of the symphony of the cosmos.
But when you say grounding, does that literally mean you have to walk barefoot on the ground?
That's it.
So
we are the only animal that doesn't, by the way. We are the
so we
only
should just take our shoes off. Everybody take your shoes off.
But
right
not
now.
Here. You have to ground
Walk up and
yourself to
down.
the earth. You have to ground. You know, also, by the way, now tree hugging has a new rationale. If you hug a tree with your bare skin, you get grounded as well. And
Is that right?
Yes.
Well, I mean, when they made up the thing about, I mean, because the environmentalists used to be sort of joked about as tree huggers, but that came from a real thing about how grounded you could get if you...
I'm saying that it is. You know, as usual, whenever I say things, they're controversial and people will say, what's the evidence? Well, we have lots of evidence now that contact with nature in any way. You know, we think of ourselves as organism here and nature out there, but those trees are your lungs. If they didn't breathe, you wouldn't breathe, and if you didn't breathe, they wouldn't breathe. The earth is recycling as your body. The rivers and oceans are recycling as your circulation. This air is your breath. So anytime you're close to nature, you actually sink in your biological rhythms, and there are many of these, circadian, seasonal, lunar, gravitational, but you reset your biological rhythms. You do the same thing when you sleep, by the way, to some extent.
So that's 6, but there's one more I want to ask you about, and you alluded to it in The Healing Self, and you alluded a little bit to it when you first started talking about how falling in love makes you feel good, and that's sex and sexual activity, which you allude to it earlier in your book.
Yes, I didn't talk about...
So why is that not number 7?
Well, actually, sex and spirituality both are very important as one is an outlet for your biological expression. There's no biological organism upwards of, rodents or even reptiles that doesn't have sex. Even paramecia have sex. So sex has biological reasons for it, but I also believe that sexual activity is, in a sense, a transcendent experience. So when you have transcendence, you touch a part of yourself which is not in time. Time is a result of subject-object split. But deep love, sexual peak experiences, transcendence, and spirituality are inseparable. The religious experience, by the way, is always 3 things. One is transcendence. That means going beyond subject-object split. No separation between the observer and the observed, between the lover and the beloved, the seer and the scenery. So transcendence, which is a timeless experience. And when there's timeless experiences, your biological clock slows down as well. I can give people that experience just now, if you want, without sex. So one is transcendence. The second is the emergence of platonic values like truth, goodness, beauty, harmony, love, compassion, joy, equanimity. And the third is the loss of the fear of death. Because in every spiritual tradition, there's a part of you which is not in time. So when you have that experience, religious experience or spiritual experience, you lose the fear of death.
So would you say that a sexual experience would contribute to well-being and therefore to your health, to your good health?
Yes, in many traditions in the world, sex and spirituality are the creative expression of the same consciousness.
So what is you talk about spirituality, and it's something I'd like to talk about. We're just running out of time. It's just too interesting, but...
there's no time.
I know, there's no time. He doesn't believe in time, by the way, so... But you also...
it's a human construct.
You also did mention, I mean, where does God, what's the difference between God and spirituality, and where, and you can answer this in 1 minute, and where does that fit into well-being?
Spirituality is best defined as self-awareness. Self-awareness. The more you are aware of your innermost being, the more you'll be aware of everything outside, because everything outside usually represents your conditioned mind. So that part of ourself that we call core being or consciousness is not in time. I can ask everyone to actually have that experience in 1 second. As you're listening to me right now, just turn your attention to that which is listening. So as you're listening to me, just turn your attention to that which is listening. And that which you're experiencing now is awareness. It's not a thought. A thought might be saying, I wish I'd gone to the bathroom before I came here. Or the thought is a fluctuation in awareness, as is an emotion, as is a perception, as is any experience. But behind all that is a timeless factor, which is just awareness. And when you're just aware, which we call being, then you have returned to your source. You're holy and you're healed.
And so if we follow all of these pillars of well-being, obviously all of us want to be well, but what happens when we get cancer or we get some horrible disease? I mean, all of us know people who are suffering from a disease, and some are people who follow or seem to follow all of these pillars, who work out and eat well and everything. And so what makes me wonder, how are we responsible for our illnesses?
I mentioned earlier, only 5% of disease-related
Yes,
gene
exactly,
mutations are
yeah.
fully penetrant. The rest are influenced by your lifestyle. But as we move into the future, by the way, our ability to look at and target specific gene mutations, the future is precise, it's personalized, it's predictable, it's preventive, it is participatory. So we are going to have a very bright future very soon because of our ability to target specific mutations, but also see what is happening in our life that is causing a specific disruption. So one of the big projects now in the world is not the genome project, which was big for its time. It's the epigenetic roadmap, which means how do we look at what is happening in a person's lifestyle, in relationships, in social interactions, in environment, in food, in the mind, in the emotional world, and how is it affecting which aspect of your biology. The fact still remains that until now, biology is very unpredictable. You can have two patients who have the same illness, see the same doctor, get the same treatment, have completely different outcomes. So biology is unpredictable. We cannot, at the moment, say who's 100% likely to get a certain disease, other than the fact that we know the 5% the 5% fully penetrant gene mutations. We are not responsible, but I think society has a responsibility collectively to minimize our propensity to disease. If there's one factor that underlies all diseases, by the way, one thing that underlies all chronic illness, I'm not talking about infectious disease, but one thing that influences is the underlying factor in every chronic illness, cardiovascular, cancer, autoimmune, it's inflammation. And inflammation has lots of causes, but an inflamed mind will cause an inflamed brain, will cause an inflamed biology, will cause inflammatory relationships, and ultimately a violent world. You know, we're not looking at violence as a public health problem right now, but it is. And if we don't, we are declaring our insanity. I think personally that violence, climate change, disruption of our food chain, hostility, social injustice, economic injustice, environment, have all to be addressed if we want a holistic way of looking at health.
I am so sorry we are out of time. And I want to thank Deepak for being our guest today. And if you would like to go back and watch tonight's full program or selected video highlights, you can access them at WashingtonPostLive.com. And a reminder to our local people is Deepak will be back in town November the 28th. He'll be talking about the future of well-being at the Strathmore Music Center in Bethesda. So thank you very much for being here, and I'm sorry that we didn't have more time to go on because he knows a lot more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.